Today I want to talk about some signs, I don't know how many I'm going to get through, that you have fearful avoidance. If you're new to this channel, secure links, then welcome. Thank you for being here. My name's Jess and I'm recovering fearful avoidant. So let's just dive right in. Sign number one, that you crave intimacy but you fear commitment. I have got some notes here. So if you see me looking over there, that's just to keep me from going off on a tangent basically. But so with fearful avoidance, oftentimes they arrive in the beginning of relationships in this kind of the dating stage as really warm individuals, really open to connection and intimacy, and they are. And then once they're faced with an opportunity for commitment is usually when they'll get triggered if they're going to and swing over into the avoidant side. Now, a lot of these individuals in their childhood, they had an experience of enmeshment. Now, I have written down something here, so I'll read it out for you. Enmeshment is a concept in psychology to describe family dynamics where personal boundaries are absent and overconcern for others leads to loss of autonomous development. And what that ultimately means is there's a family dynamic going on where the child is often needing to soothe the caregiver before their needs are met. So their needs get put on the back burner and they have to meet the needs of the caregiver before they get their needs met, if they do at all. What happens then is this creates like a distance in their own emotional needs, and they tend to push their emotional needs down in order to soothe the caregiver. So what this looks like in adulthood is the fearful avoidant has kind of internalized that if they were to enter a relationship, they have to give up all their sense of self and all their independence and endlessly give to this other person, which obviously is not healthy. So that's where there's a little bit of a struggle comes on, because they want that connection with other people, but once the commitment arrives, they then have to, they don't have to, they definitely shouldn't be, but their internal program is telling them that to do that and to go through that commitment phase, they have to give themselves all their independence over to this other person, which they obviously don't want to do because there is a part of them that is hyper independent. And when they're single, they are hyper independent and they're quite happy being single, apart from obviously they do, crave intimacy. So this is where you'll get this kind of hot and cold behaviour where they are hot and then they'll come close, and then once they get close enough that there's a lot of intimacy there and potentially commitment, they'll shot back again. They'll shoot back in order to regain some sense of self, because with a fearful avoidant, they don't know how to integrate both of these things together. In a secure attachment, obviously you are wanting to meet other people's needs but also meet your own. With a fearful avoidant, if they're meeting your needs, they're ignoring their own. So that's where they get scared about that. Again, I'm just going to read out a couple of notes that I've written. So I've put, unlike the anxious preoccupied who doesn't have that independence and strong knowing of who they are outside of a relationship, the anxious individual merging their life with somebody else feels like a sense of relief, because the anxious preoccupied is ultimately codependent. They need somebody else to co-regulate because they weren't taught to regulate on their own. They don't know how to do it. The dismissive avoidant doesn't ever really lose their sense of self. They have really strong boundaries in relationships and they know how to self-regulate. They struggle to co-regulate. With a fearful avoidant, they want to merge their life with somebody else, but they don't get that sense of relief like the anxious preoccupied. They actually start to feel very dysregulated because, again, they're kind of helping the other person regulate their emotions and things, and they're ignoring their own. Number two, you can find yourself in quite unhealthy relationships. And this is kind of because you bounce between under and overtaking responsibility. Now, how to try and break this down is that an anxious preoccupied has a positive sense of others and a negative sense of self. And an avoidant has a negative sense of others and a positive sense of self. So when you're switching, when you're in FA and you're triggered by, depending on what's triggered you, you can bounce between feeling like, well, that person's screaming at me and shouting at me. And if you're in your anxious phase, well, I must have done something wrong and I deserve this, and this is all my fault. And when you're on your avoidant side, you can take a step back emotionally and be like, this is interesting. This person is screaming at me. There's something absolutely wrong with them, and it can't be anything to do with what I've done. So then it's basically alternating between your thoughts thinking, well, the toxic behaviours and patterns in this relationship are either all my fault or all the other person's fault. For a secure person, they can kind of step back and do both and decide on how they're going to respond to the situation dependent on, well, just dependent on the situation, and use both logic and emotions together. The fearful avoidant doesn't do that because they're either in anxious mode or fearful or avoidant mode, and they can't be in both of them phases together, so they do neither, and they're switching constantly, and this can ultimately leave you ending up in really, really toxic, unhealthy relationships. Sign number 3, you don't feel deserving of a healthy relationship. So, with the anxious individual, they have this kind of wound where they feel unworthy, but they know at the core that they are a good person, they're an emotional person, and they want what's best for everybody. The avoidant knows that they're not very an emotional person, but they're a very stable, practical person, that they know what they've got to offer. With an unhealed, fearful avoidant, it's like you can see these unhealthy patterns in relationships that are played out. You also feel unworthy of healthy love, but it's like they know that they've got a fear of commitment, and they know that they can have these quite emotional, impulsive reactions. So therefore, it seems in the mindset of fearful avoidant that you're always the common denominator, because you're either triggered by an anxious person or you're triggered by an avoidant person, and you've got both traits. If you're obviously not healed and you're not aware, that you keep switching from, and it's just like whatever relationship you seem to get in, because often you're not going to attract a secure attached person. If you've got these traits, secure attached tend to attract secure attached people and tend to stay together. Insecure attached individuals tend to come together. So if you've either attracted an avoidant or an anxious person, you're still the common denominator that can get triggered. Them also, but you were very aware of these, and you can kind of know when you are being manipulative. The positive thing that I can basically take from all of this is, now that I'm healing, basically I can see the link between my triggers and my behaviors, and the step towards secure attachment is basically being aware of what your triggers are so that you can decide what your behaviors are going to be, and knowing that basically the behaviors that you exhibited in the past was not because you had bad intentions to hurt somebody or use protest behaviors or to block people out. They were never to intentionally hurt somebody, but they were trigger responses. And now that you're aware of triggers, you can decide to react differently and hurt yourself less and hurt other people less. Sign number 4 is you want others to be vulnerable before you are. So with the anxious or a secure attached person, they, in the early stages of dating, will lean in towards getting to know the person, because that's kind of normal if you're wanting to build an emotional connection. And you'll notice that the dismissive avoidant is kind of more standoffish and take a standoffish approach, and let the anxious person or the secure person, if they did end up with, very unlikely, but if they did end up with a secure person, they're going to lead the connection, and they're quite happy with that because they're a little bit more uncomfortable with emotions. Now the fearful avoidant is kind of in the middle of both of them. So it's like they come up really warm when you're getting to know them, but you might come away from a conversation like, I feel like they like me, but I don't actually know much about that individual because they didn't really share a lot with me. Like, their interest is there, but the vulnerability isn't there until that person's kind of vulnerable, and then they'll feel a little bit safe to be vulnerable. What the fearful avoidant is looking for is quite a fine-tuned balance between somebody who isn't going to push them into the anxious side and is quite standoffish, because that's going to trigger their abandonment wound, but also somebody who isn't very anxious, because that's going to then trigger their deactivation strategies and their avoidant tendencies. So it's just somewhere in the middle that you would be looking for as a fearful avoidant. The reason why they're so fine-tuned is because to be vulnerable is to give up their independence, and their autonomy. So they're looking basically for somebody they're not going to be rejected by that person because they don't want to swing on their anxious side, and someone who doesn't choose them too much, because that's going to make them swing on their avoidant side and make them feel a little bit smothered and suffocated. I think that's going to be it for this video today. I am going to do a part 2 to signs that you have fearful avoidance, so keep looking out for that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you took something away from this and you learned something. If you've got a fearful avoidant partner or you're fearful avoidant yourself, if you did, please remember to like the video, and if you like my content, please subscribe to my channel.